All right, hey athletes, welcome to lesson 2 of the anatomy course. This lesson will start with, our technical anatomy, and so this lesson will be focusing on the skull of the head, the bulk of our first mass. Now, we will not review the muscles of the skull for this lesson, as it's not necessarily super important in our view that you know all of these muscles in detail. I certainly haven't learned them all. I've looked at them, I know what they are from a graphic point of view, but I really don't use them as much. I rely a lot more on the things we've already discussed in a lot of our classrooms, being the Loomis head and the Riley rhythms, as these are particularly relevant to the muscles of the head. And you can see that in the classroom that I have about the Riley rhythms and the Loomis head construction. So be sure to review that. So only the bones kind of serve as the landmarks for head construction. Now, again, feel free to learn the muscles on top as well if you want to, and review that Loomis head construction video that we have on the website already. When we look at the skull from a front and 3/4 view, we can essentially identify the following features. We have the frontal bone, onto which the frontalis muscle sits. Again, not really necessary for you to know, but we'll review it anyway. We have the nasal bone. We have the temporal bone, on which the temporalis muscle sits. We have the zygomatic bone, or the cheekbone, onto which the zygomaticus muscle sits. As you can see, all of this relates. And we have the maxilla, so that's the upper jawbone that holds the upper part of our teeth. And then we have the mandible, which is the lower jaw that holds the lower part of your teeth. It's also important to know that the mandible itself is detachable from the skull, as you probably have seen this before, and it kind of acts as a hinge joint for us to open our mouth. When we look at this from the side, we can further identify the parietal bone and the occipital bone. The occipital bone has many different parts at the back where the posterior muscles of the neck attach. It's easier to understand, though, that the skull consists of 2 main parts. Basically, the cranium, which is the large round thing, and the mandibles that make up, or where our teeth reside. When constructing the skull, I find the easiest way to locate the features that make up the skull is by starting with a simplified Loomis head. When we start with a Loomis head, lay in the proportions of the facial features very crudely, and then add the basic form for the eye sockets and nasal bone, we can already start to see a first indication of the skull. We can then continue to add more complex detail that complete the illusion of a skull. Again, we're not really drawing a skull, we're just drawing the illusion of a skull. When we look at the planar view of the skull, we can see how the nasal bone, the zygomatic bone, and the mandibles, as you can see here in the illustration, can be represented by simple manipulated boxes. These forms will make it a lot easier for you to orient the skull in space and understand these complex forms individually. The mandible and the zygomatic bone, for instance, while appearing very complex, when drawn in a planar manner, are a lot easier to understand in terms of their volume and their orientation in space. We recommend you practice this way of thinking for many of the complexities of the body. Again, thinking about those manipulated simple forms. Another thing to keep in mind is that we can change the proportions of the skull, or better put, the characters we create can have very distinctive features that are still primarily dictated by the skull's features. Yet the skull features are flexible in their proportions. As you can see here in the example, for my main character, Pierce, here we can see the skull underneath would have a slightly larger cranium and very protruding chin and mandible bones, especially the mandible for the lower jaw. Your assignment for this lesson will be to draw the front, side, and 3/4 view of the skull and indicate its different bone features. As mentioned before, in this lesson, we recommend you start with the Loomis head. Again, go from a simplified Loomis head to adding the simple features of the nasal bone, and then the mandibles, and then continue on. Then you are going to use the reference image provided that contains a lot of busts. Now your task will be to draw the skull of each bust in the angle in which that bust is placed, again to practice your orientation. To help you do that, we strongly suggest you start with the simplified Loomis head again, then add those facial features as we mentioned in the video, and then draw the skull features on top. If that is still too hard, think about that planar view of the skull that we mentioned in the video as well and that we've shown, and kind of reconstruct the individual features like the zygomatic bone or the mandibles into these more simplified, manipulated boxes to better orientate your skull features in space. All right, art leads, that's it. Good luck, and we'll see you in the next lesson.